everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment for today's show, let's talk about one game that I will definitely, as a Seattle Seahawks fan, be watching very closely with a lot at stake for both of these NFC playoff hopefuls, Packers, Seahawks. Now, I actually thought, funnily enough, that the Sunday night game for some reason was Steelers Eagles because it showed up when I look at my ESPN app as the last game there. But since I'm a Seahawks fan, I starred them as one of my favorite teams. They kind of rose up, and that's why I thought that way. So I had to kind of rejigger a couple things for my segments. But ultimately, I'm excited to talk about this game more in depth because, well, it is my favorite team we're discussing here. But without further ado, let's just jump right into it. Green Bay, let's talk about the betting perspective first and then get into the key factors in this one. Green Bay on the road, 2.5-point favorites. The over-under 45.5. So potentially a highly low-scoring game here. Green Bay minus 140 in terms of money line. Seattle plus 120. So ultimately a very close game between two very similar teams in many different ways. But let's break it down. Let's talk about the Packers first, because I do feel like out of all the teams Seattle have played in the past 4 weeks in terms of their 4-game winning streak, no team will test them like the Packers can. They have a talented tight end in Tucker Kraft, who's one thing. They have a talented running back in Josh Jacobs who can impose his will. And you have a quarterback who has a wealth of receivers who at any given time can step up and say they're the wide receiver one. So that's going to be very difficult for the Seattle defense. But if any defense right now can slow down this Packers offense, it looks to be the Seattle Seahawks, surprisingly. And not many people have said that at the midpoint of the season when they had their bye week. But after the bye week, I was reading an article about this a little bit earlier, they have been statistically one of the best defenses in all of football. First, in terms of defensive EPA per play against the pass, 5th against the run. And I feel like, the way I see it, this is indicative of what Mike McDonald does to a certain defense. He did with Baltimore in his first year there, where they kind of got off to a slow start and became one of the better units on the stretch, and now he's doing with Seattle. And the difference is, he's trusting a lot more of his corners and secondary players to hang tight in man coverage, take away the deep plays in this offense. And so we're seeing this defense, even though they haven't really gotten as much pressure as they had early in this season in terms of getting to the quarterback, really stick home in coverage, whether it be in too high, cover 2, cover 4. In certain situations, we've really seen how aggressive the secondary can get. And they have 2 of the better corners in the league, young ones at that, Enrique Woolen and Devin Witherspoon. And so that's been a huge part of this defensive resurgence for Seattle. But when I look at this Packers team, they're well equipped to not care about that. They're well equipped to beat you horizontally rather than vertically. They love the short yardage game. They love relying on Josh Jacobs both as a rusher and a receiver. And that's really going to challenge this Seahawks defense laterally. And most importantly, Jordan Love's going to be a huge X factor in this one. And I feel like Jordan Love's play in the short to intermediate areas of the field, especially in the red zone, is highly integral to the Packers' success in this game. Can he really get it to his most physical weapons, like Tucker Kraft, like Jaden Reed, in certain situations? And then, in certain situations as well, in early downs, have Josh Jacobs try and wear down the Seahawks front 7 to the point where they can open up and get explosive down the field for a guy like Christian Watson or Romeo Doubs. And so that's why I feel like this Packers offense is more multifaceted than anything thrown at Seattle these past 4 weeks. This is not an indictment of Seattle because I still love them as a fan, but I do think that's where the difference between these two teams is brought to light. Between the multifaceted nature of this Packers offense that can really attack Seattle in a way as as this defense really has been challenged. And so that's the difference here for me. On the Seattle side of things, as Tyler Sperry comes into the chat and says, don't promote Charbonnet unless Walker is out. I'm not saying I'll promote Charbonnet wholeheartedly, but I do think that if Walker is out, Charbonnet has a chance to have another decent day here. Because on the Seattle side of things, the way they look offensively actually will play into a more physical style than we've seen from them. Because this season, Seattle has come up passing because they're kind of forced to, right? This line simply can't run block that well and haven't had enough continuity to do it at a high level as a result. So ultimately, they've had to pass a lot more than they've wanted to. But in those situations, Geno has been very efficient, especially in third and long and fourth and long situations. Geno has been incredibly efficient in those situations. And so I do feel like, though, in this matchup, to really take control of the game, they're going to want to feed the ball to who's ever at the running back position, as Tyler alluded to. And if it's Charbonnet, I actually think he'll have a better opportunity than Kenneth Walker, because Walker's more about getting a little bit shifty at the line, whereas Charbonnet makes the right read according to what he sees and just takes it up the middle. And so that's what is the difference here for me in terms of the effectiveness of the Seahawks run game. Can both of these guys, no matter who's running the football, just make the correct reads at the line and help out their O-line as a result? If that's the case, then look for the Seahawks to try and take control of this game away from what the Packers can do offensively. And most importantly, remain on schedule and in rhythm. Because that's the thing with this Seahawks offense. Right? The defense is trying to take care of things in terms of limiting what offenses can do very well. Seattle, on offense, just trying to remain as efficient as possible. But I do think in terms of the pass game, we're going to see a lot more DK Metcalf than JSN in this one. Not an indictment of JSN either, because he's truly been remarkable for what he's done for Seattle this season, especially in the slot as well. And I feel like everyone is really jumping on the JSN bandwagon. But let's not forget about DK Metcalf and what he can do, not just as a route runner, but physically as well. To physically challenge a Packers defense is going to predicate itself on takeaways. Really going to test Geno in terms of disguising coverages, in terms of tempting him in certain situations. And so DK Metcalf's physicality can be a huge difference maker. And we'll talk about this in our next segment as well, in how this game is played. As Tyler mentioned, everyone is saying Charbonnet is like Derrick Henry. If Walker plays, Charbonnet will only get 4 carries. And I agree with that sentiment, right? Because they want to get Kenneth Walker going. He can be a huge asset to this offense when he does get going. But I think that a large part of it is the offensive line and what Walker does, whether it be to their success or to their detriment. I do feel like when I look at both of them on a per-game basis, I feel like Charbonnet has been the one to have helped out this offensive line a little bit more. And this is not an indictment of Walker as a runner. I think he's a fabulous player. But I do feel like in certain situations, he misreads the line and the way they pull, and especially in short yardage situations as well, which I'm really frustrated about and what this game could ultimately come down to. But also, when I look at Charbonnet, when he's asked to step up is the difference here. I feel like, the reason why I feel like Charbonnet could have a decent game if Kenneth Walker is absent is exactly for that reason. Because when he's the focal point of this offense, that's where he shines. But I agree that when Kenneth Walker is in, this offense and this offensive line as a result kind of stagnates because Charbonnet is not necessarily back there making the reads. It's also, Tyler says, Jair Alexander is playing. I didn't even know he was injured, so Metcalf will have a tough day if Alexander plays. I kind of disagree with that sentiment because I feel like DK Metcalf is going to be physical enough and going to want to set the tone in the passing game in terms of especially short yardage situation. So I do think that Metcalf won't even care if Jair Alexander plays or not. And I actually didn't even know Jair Alexander was injured, so that's on me. But ultimately, I do think when I look at what Seattle's offense can do in the pass game, it can remain efficient whether it's JSN or DK Metcalf. It's just that against a tough defense like the Packers, I think DK will matter more. It might not even be about him having a good or bad day. It might just come down to him being physical and really testing and occupying these Packers corners to kind of open up maybe for JSN and Lockett. But ultimately, when I think about this matchup, I think that Jair Alexander hasn't necessarily been tested physically by a receiver. And remember this, the Packers are 1-4 in games against a team in the NFC with a winning record. And whenever they go to Seattle, and yes, this is of a bygone era kind of, magical things happen. However, I do think that it will come down to the Packers' offense versus Seattle's defense. I just don't think Seattle's defense has been tested in a way. I do think it will be a high-scoring game. Seattle could potentially cover in this one as well, but I am going to take the Packers, like I mentioned when I was making my picks yesterday, just because I don't necessarily think that ultimately Seattle can keep up with this team. But this is not an indictment of my Seahawks, and it proves that I'm kind of unbiased here in what I pick for them. But ultimately, it's going to come down to that Packers offense and how effective they can be. And I just think they can be a little bit more effective than that Seattle defense. But ultimately, who knows? Like I said, magic happens when these two teams play in Seattle, and might be for the home team this time. But let's see what you guys think in the comments as well, like Tyler Sperry mentioned. But coming up next, we talk a little bit more about this game from a stardom sit-in perspective, giving y'all some fantasy advice in that department. So we'll be right back to conclude today's show with that.